Hey, Don't Call Tech Support here, and with the release of the Ryzen 3rd Gen processors, the prices of multi-core CPUs has never been lower. The other day I saw a 1st Gen Ryzen 1600 for under $100, and that made me wonder how a dual-core CPU would hold up in today's games. Now the test subject in question is the Intel Pentium G4620. This is a 3.7 GHz dual-core CPU with hyperthreading, meaning it has 2 physical cores but 4 logical cores. I tested with and without hyperthreading enabled, and in the benchmarks where there are no numbers for the 4620 without hyperthreading, that was because the game would not run or it would run horribly. I tested with the GTX 1070 and 16GB of 3200MHz CL16 memory on a C170A motherboard. We start off with the Division 2, and this game worked with only 2 cores, but there were horrible stutters frequently, making the game pretty much unplayable. With hyperthreading, the game was playable, but it was far from smooth. The average FPS of the 4-core i5 is almost 15% ahead of the Pentium, with the frame times being close to twice as fast. Next up is Rainbow Six Siege. So this game would not start with only 2 logical cores, but the 4620 with hyperthreading did quite good in this title. The average frame rate matched that of the i5 6600K, but the frame times was quite a bit worse, I'm afraid. However, on the bright side, they did manage to stay close to 60 frames per second, meaning the game was fully playable at 1080p. In 1440p, the frame times takes a deep dive under 60 frames per second to 43.7 frames per second for the 0.1% low, but the average isn't too far behind the i5 here either. Now let's check out The Witcher 3. So this game would start with only 2 cores, but it was completely unplayable at 1080p. With hyperthreading, the game was playable, but performance fell short of that of the i5 6600K. It was 13% behind for the average frame rate, and the 1% low figure was equal to the i5 6600K's 0.1% low figure, bumping up the resolution to 1440p, and the non-hyperthreaded part managed to make it through the benchmark. But the gameplay was far from smooth, and with hyperthreading enabled, the Pentium performed slightly better than the i5 6600K for the average, but the frame times are well under 30 frames per second, making the gameplay really choppy. Now, Shadow of the Tomb Raider is next, and this is another title that didn't like our CPU with only 2 logical cores, but with hyperthreading, the game would start and run, but performance was awful. Frame times here are under 20 frames per second, and the average frame rate trails the i5 6600K by 35%. Now, upping the resolution to 1440p evens out the average frame rate, but the frame times are still just as awful as before. Ghost Recon Wildlands is next, and no, the frame times for the 4620 without hyperthreading is not a typo. The 0.1% low was indeed 0.1% frames per second, same as the 1% low. The average frame rate was also cut in half compared to the hyperthreaded result, which was already trailing the i5 by 18%. Now the frame times were better with 4 logical cores, but under 30 frames per second leads to very choppy gameplay. Increasing the resolution to 1440p and the average frame rate is now matching the i5, but the frame times are still terrible, and without hyperthreading the game becomes completely unplayable. Okay, but what about a game that doesn't take advantage of multi-core CPUs? Well, that's what we have next with the Elder Scrolls Online. This is the only title where turning off hyperthreading increased our frame rate, though it has to be said that CPU usage was pretty much 100% while running the benchmark, and the Pentium is still 22% behind the i5 6600K, but that is to be expected with the 1.1 GHz advantage in clock speed that the i5 has. And that rounds out what I had in store for you today. Now, I have gotten my hands on an RTX 2070 Super, so that video is due to be released as soon as I finished my tests. But yeah, until then, thank you so much for watching, and farewell.